Okay, good evening, everyone, those in person here and those accessing us remotely. Welcome to our very special lecture, sponsored by the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute and delivered in commemoration of the 110th anniversary of the start of the Armenian Genocide on April 24, 1915. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute to welcome you to this very special event. We are delighted to welcome our well-known UCLA colleague, Professor Melissa Bilal of UCLA's Herb Alpert School of Music, who will provide a lecture for us entitled Pavagan, Enough, Zabel Yesayan's Political Thought on Peace, Justice, and People's Right to Self-Defense. We are also delighted to welcome Dr. Anna Alexanian, one of our postdoctoral scholars with the Armenian Genocide Research Program at the Promise Armenian Institute, who will serve as discussant after the lecture. As you can tell from the title, Professor Bilal's lecture will focus on the Armenian feminist writer and activist Zabel Yesayan, whose piece, Pavagan, was published in 1922 as creative nonfiction or autobiographical fiction pertaining to the First Balkan War in 1912 to 1913. Yet in the decade between that war and the publication in 1922, Yesayan narrowly escaped the purges against Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople as the only woman on the list of Armenian intellectuals and leaders targeted for arrest and deportation by the Ottoman Young Turk government on April 24, 1915. Yesayan spent the years of World War I and the post-war period working on the ground to provide aid for the survivors of the Armenian Genocide, to save orphans, and to prepare eyewitness reports on the atrocities. Professor Bilal will discuss Yesayan's essay and other writings as a fundamental contribution of documentation of our Ottoman political thought and thus to the genocide in that very dark period of history. As I mentioned, this event is organized by the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA and is also co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the UCLA Center for the Study of Women, the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA Law School, the UCLA Narakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, the UCLA Richard Hovhannissian Endowed Chair of Modern Armenian History, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Ararat Eskidjan Museum. We are grateful to all of our co-sponsors. And on behalf of UCLA and our UCLA co-sponsors, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a privilege for our institution to acknowledge the history on which our institution is established. Before I introduce Professor Bilal as well as Dr. Alexanian more formally, let me just mention a few procedural items. First, let me note that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel and should be visible now on YouTube as well as Zoom. Second, for those of you here in our audience, after the lecture and discussant commentary are finished, we will invite you to offer questions to our speakers. Just raise your hand and your voice should be audible through our microphone system. For those of you watching on the Zoom webinar platform, if you have a question, we ask that you pose it in the Q&A window by clicking on the green button on your Zoom window and typing in your question. In either case, please make sure your questions are as succinct and clear as possible. And once again, for those on Zoom, in the unlikely event that the Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the Zoom link and it will put you back into our session. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our speakers for the evening. First, Professor Melissa Bilal is a sociocultural anthropologist and historian specializing in music and performance studies, gender and sexuality studies, and memory studies. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnomusicology and the Department of Music Performance, Education, and Composition at UCLA's Herb Alpert School of Music, where she holds the newly endowed Promise Chair in Armenian Music, Arts, and Culture, and also serves as the director of the Armenian Music Program. Dr. Bilal has a PhD from the University of Chicago, and her ethnographic research explores the role of music in the transmission of Armenian memory in Turkey, while her archival research is focused on the musical and intellectual history of Armenians in the late Ottoman Empire and early Republican Turkey. Dr. Anna Alexanian, the discussant for Professor Bilal's talk, earned her PhD in 2022 from the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University under the mentorship of Dr. Taner Akçam. Her research focuses on gendered aspects of the Armenian genocide, particularly the experience of victimized females between 1914 and 1918. Before pursuing her doctoral studies, she worked as a senior research fellow and head of source studies of the Armenian Genocide Department at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan. She received her BA and MA in history from Yerevan State University and has also served for several years as an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Armenia. And as I say, she is currently one of our postdoctoral scholars here at UCLA. So, Melissa, I will now turn the event over to you. Let's welcome Melissa to our.
Thank you, Dr. Karagözyan. Thank you all for coming. I would like to thank also for the kind invitation to deliver the Armenian Genocide lecture this year. Many thanks to Hasmik Balbasaryan and Mary Sekayan and others who labored for the organization of this event. Many thanks to the co-sponsors who helped us reach out to a multidisciplinary community. And finally, many thanks to Dr. Anna Alexanian for accepting to discuss my paper and enrich it with her expertise. This lecture is based on a chapter that I published in a volume titled Histories of Political Thought in the Ottoman World, edited by Kaya Shahin and Nedim Nomer, that came out recently from Oxford University Press. And as far as I know, this is the very first time an Armenian voice, especially Armenian women public intellectuals' voice, an Armenian feminist activist, Ottoman citizens' political writing has been included in such a volume. Although I have started my work on Pavagan about 2 decades ago, my deeper diving into Yesayan's life and work, thanks to the massive research we conducted with Dr. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu of MIT on the history of Ottoman and post-Ottoman Armenian feminism for our book, Feminism in Armenian, 12 Biographies and Primary Sources, which will come out from Indiana University Press next year, has been the main motivation behind publishing a separate chapter on Zabel Yesayan's Pavagan in this important volume on the histories of political thought in the Ottoman world by, as I said, Kaya Shahin and Nedim Nomer. The original photographs and documents that I will share on my slides today are also from the Feminism in Armenian, 12 Biographies and Primary Sources book with Lerna Ekmekçioğlu, and they will be printed both in the book and be featured on our companion website sometime next year. Here we go. I offer my reading of Pavagan with the hope that it will resonate with your own search for a conscientious response to the ongoing atrocities today. In In 1922, Armenian feminist writer and activist Zabel Yesayan serialized a story in the monthly Arek, meaning Sun journal, published then in Vienna, entitled Pavagan, Enough. This piece conveys Yesayan's thoughts on war and militarism. Its epigraph, Notes and Impressions from the Balkan War, written in November 1912 Constantinople, refers to the First Balkan War, which started in October-November 1912 and soon escalated into a regional war. The period between autumn 1912, when Yesayan penned Pavagan, or she says she penned Pavagan, and January 1922, when Pavagan actually came out in print, was a fatal time for Ottoman Armenians. Following the events discussed in the piece, the Committee of Union and Progress came to power with a coup in 1913, led the Ottoman Empire to World War I, and masterminded the Armenian genocide. Yesayan escaped the purges against Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople by hiding and fleeing to Bulgaria, Romania, and eventually to the Caucasus. In Tbilisi, one of the major Armenian cultural centers of the time, she was united with a community of Armenians, including those community of Eastern Armenians and those who had similarly fled from the genocide in the Ottoman Empire. During the war and the immediate post-war period, with the hopes of saving her arrested and deported friends, Yesayan devoted her time to give lectures on the literary legacy of Ottoman Armenians and the ongoing atrocities against them. She also committed herself to publishing eyewitness accounts, including women's experiences of sexual violence, as well as their role in organized resistance. In 1919, arriving in France by way of Iran, Iraq, and Egypt, Yesayan assumed a role in the campaign supporting demands for Armenian self-determination during the Paris Peace Conference. She prepared a report and submitted it to the Armenian national delegation to Paris with the purpose of bringing the horrors that non-Muslim women and children endured and suffered during the genocide. A few months after writing this report, she delivered a public lecture in Paris with the same goal. In 1920, 11 years after her on-the-ground orphan relief work in the immediate aftermath of the 1909 Armenian massacres in Cilicia, she was back in the region, in Cilicia, this time to organize Armenian orphans' transfer to safety against the approaching Kemalist takeover. After its publication in 1922 in Arek, a pro-Soviet Armenia journal, Pavagan was reprinted in Istanbul in 1925, 2 years after the foundation of the Republic of Turkey and after Yesayan's permanent flee from her country of birth, her hometown. Its first reprint, Pavagan's first reprint after this 1925 edition, was in Turkish translation in the book A Cry for Justice, 5 Armenian feminist writers from Ottoman times to modern Turkey, which I edited with Lernaik Mekçioğlu in 2006. So ever since, I have been revisiting this little-known text to interpret it in relation to Yesayan's life experiences, activism, and other writings that help me contextualize her standpoint with regard to peace, justice, and people's right to self-defense. Little bit about Zabel Yesayan as a feminist anti-militarist thinker. Zabel Hovannesyan Yesayan assumed her first visible role in Constantinopolitan Armenian feminist scene in 1903 and 1904 as the editor of the women's section in one of the most popular weeklies, Zabel Flower, where she published her first series of articles on women's emancipation. Throughout her life, she defended women's liberation as a prerequisite of a larger societal change. She owned and defended the struggle for women's rights as a just and obvious cause. She also used her pen consistently to spotlight class exploitation, including within the Armenian community. Her intersectional feminist thought, from a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw recently, I mean, a couple of decades ago. But in our perspective today, her feminism is intersectional. Her intersectional feminist thought and activism unfolded around Armenian people's struggle for survival in the Ottoman Empire and prioritized questions of social injustice and class injustice and racial violence. A letter she wrote to her husband, Dikran Yesayan, in January 1907 suggests that Yesayan, Zabel, was a member of a women's peace organization in France. In this letter from Cairo to Paris, Zabel asked Dikran to obtain a note of recommendation from Maria Szeliga, the famous Polish socialist feminist and peace activist, then based in Paris. And Yesayan intended to use this note by Szeliga to introduce herself to the Persian ambassador in Constantinople as a member of this peace league, by which she meant the Universal Alliance of Women for Peace Through Education. According to an article titled Xavagutyan Hamar for Peace that Yesayan published in İzmir's Arevelian Mamul in May 1906, a month earlier, then President Maria Szeliga hosted an international group of women in her Paris salon and invited Yesayan. In her speech during this meeting, Szeliga talked about women's central role in shattering animosities and their legitimate demand to stop wars, and inspired Yesayan would soon consider the possibility of founding a similar organization in the Ottoman capital, perhaps one of the long-imagined international branches of this league chaired by Szeliga. In 1908, approximately 2 years after attending this gathering in Paris, Yesayan arrived in Constantinople, motivated by the July 1908 restoration of the Ottoman constitutional regime, and she immediately joined the newly revitalized activist groups working for Armenian women's rights, for female education. And by November 1908, she was also actively planning the Ottoman Women's Solidarity League with Hassan Fehmi's French wife, whose name remains unknown to us. This league that she planned, the Ligue de Solidarité des Dames Ottomanes, Ottoman Women's Solidarity League, was going to be a platform for Armenian, Turkish, and other Ottoman women from various ethno-religious groups to come together, to educate each other, and unite around their common interests. It was going to work to build and maintain solidarity among the nations that made up the Ottoman country. These two intellectual activist women had already identified a committee to write the bylaws of this peace organization. A letter Yesayan wrote from Miss Hassan Fehmi's residence in Kadıköy, this letter, she asked Dikran to contact Szeliga again because Dikran is in Paris, Zabel is in Istanbul, and she asks Dikran to go contact Szeliga and this time get a copy of their organization's program and urgently send it to Istanbul, to Constantinople, because they thought, Ms. Hassan Fehmi and Zabel Yesayan thought they could use Szeliga's organization's program as a model to write their own organization's bylaw in Istanbul. According to French writer and journalist Marcel Tinaib, who personally met Yesayan, the planned committee of 9 women was not formed due to the April events. She writes April events, by which she most probably meant the assassination of Hassan Fehmi, the counter-revolutionary attempt, the suppression, and the massacres against Armenians in Cilicia in 1909. 2 years later, in 1911, in her Gine Xavagutyan Hamar, Peace, Women for Peace article, Yesayan wished that the women's organizations in France that advocated for peace through education collaborated with feminists in other countries. Echoing Szeliga, Yesayan attributed to women the exclusive role of raising peaceful generations by teaching them to resolve conflict without aggression. According to Yesayan, as mothers, sisters, and wives, women were responsible for preserving the family and were by nature against hostility and cruelty, regardless of their race and class. They would never be seduced by the gains of war, as men so often are. A proof of this, according to Yesayan, was the fact that in history, women appeared as active warriors only in situations of self-defense. This perspective on the difference between military offense and self-defense as people's resistance must have been developed in response to Yesayan's first-hand experience of meeting Cilician survivors from villages where Armenians, regardless of their sex and age, were able to collectively resist the armed attackers. Armed attackers. Yesayan had arrived in Cilicia in July 1909 as an appointed member of the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople's second delegation to the massacre-torn region. Together with an Ottoman court-martial delegation, they were sent from the capital to investigate the situation in Cilicia, the aftermath of the pogroms, and oversee relief work. For the next 3 months, Yesayan lived in Cilicia. She worked on the ground with Red Cross and served as a director of orphans. This experience was transformative for her. It strengthened her conviction that justice was a prerequisite for peace, which had become an urgent mission in the aftermath of the massacres perpetrated against the Armenian people. Yesayan met Armenians who participated in the self-defense of Kars Bazar, Hajin, Sheikh Murad, and Chok Marzvan, 4 yol. She was also permitted to visit the Armenian political prisoners, we know this through letters, most of whom were organizers of self-defense. Organizers of self-defense were prisoned by the Ottoman government, and she was able to, permitted to visit them. She was also allowed to mediate between Armenian political prisoners and the Ottoman authorities. While serving in the committee to establish a state orphanage, Yesayan had a conflict with the newly appointed Adana governor, Cemal Bey, over the official language of the orphanage, because all of the orphanages were Armenian, and she obviously wanted the official language of the orphanage be Armenian. Cemal Bey would later become Cemal Pasha, a member of the CUP triumvirate that masterminded the Armenian genocide. Yesayan returned to Constantinople deeply disturbed not only by the enormity of suffering, but also the complicity of the CUP government and the local elites in the mass violence. She was further disturbed by the government's failure to deliver the urgent and vital compensation that they promised the survivors. In a series of articles published in 1910 and 1911, she meticulously reported the persistent misery of orphans in Cilicia and the dire need to bring help to the region. In 1911, in her preface to Averagnerun Match in the Ruins, referring to the bold promises of freedom and equality made to Ottoman Armenians in 1908 revolution, Yesayan addressed the Ottoman government from the subject position of an equal citizen demanding justice. It is not a coincidence that in her 1911 article on peace, this one, right after 2 years after 1909, Zabel Yesayan situates justice at the core of her understanding of peace. She states that to achieve peace, social and political injustices must be corrected, racial and communal rights must be granted, and diversity must be celebrated and nourished for peace instead of enmity. This perspective is also key to her anti-militarist and peace activist perspective. Basically, no justice, no peace. And I argue that it's important for understanding the multi-layered text of Pavagan. Now I turn to Pavagan as an anti-militarist text. Written in the first person with elements of creative nonfiction and semi-autobiographical fiction, Pavagan opens with the terrifying news of the declaration of the First Balkan War after days of waiting in uncertainty. And let me remind you that Armenians were fighting on both sides, both as Ottoman soldiers and as a part of General Antranik's troop on the Balkan side. Yesayan and later Ottoman authorities are going to accuse and blame non-Muslim soldiers in the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman army for the Ottoman army's defeat. Yesayan depicts the militarization of everyday life and the mood in the Ottoman capital. Some people rejoice while others are horrified. Yesayan also draws attention to the reality that daily monotony continues on the home front while human lives turn into corpses on the battlefield. Moreover, those in Constantinople who are far from the bloodshed, including the protagonist herself, can afford to forget that there is a war. While in her solitude, she tries to face war and to imagine a full picture of the fighting, yet she fails. She contrasts her agitated state of mind with the nocturnal serenity of the city, and in the morning she wakes up to the sound of the town crier's drum calling for conscription. With the call for mobilization, war spreads to the home front and becomes omnipresent in civilian life. Families are terrorized by thoughts about their sons' recruitment, but fail to perceive the massive scale of the war machine. The protagonist's thought moves back and forth between the experiences of the masses and the attitude of the urban bourgeoisie, a circle to which she herself belongs to and has the chance to closely observe. Quote, "We are gathered at a friend's house, discussing things that interest us around a tea table. The conversation dwindles and we fall silent. Our eyes say to another, there is a battle at this very moment. But we suppress the strange thought, a monster in the room. Yet again the conversation revolves around the arts and literature. We argue about a newly published novel. We get excited and we laugh. Jokes and witty remarks compete with one another. And then suddenly the smiles freeze on our faces and everyone becomes pensive. The thought that we tried to suppress earlier has assumed soul and flesh, possessing our moods." Later in the text, as weeks pass and news arrives about the defeat suffered by the Ottoman army while the recruitment continues, the protagonist turns to a powerful portrayal of the physical transformation of the urban space. Lights and sounds convey the lived experience of the war, and the sorrow befalls on households and neighborhoods. Quote, "Slowly, in the peaceful and self-contained neighborhoods, the lights, instead of being lit, begin glimmer, and the supreme call of recruitment ascends over the city in the town criers, sometimes shrill, sometimes ceremonious voices. The doors and windows are shut, even tighter, the glimmering lights gradually fade out, while the thunder of bombardment continues into the bright, warm night. The protagonist expresses her rage towards those who, in their self-interest, approve of war. She draws attention to the fact that those who command people to sacrifice their lives are usually not the people who are directly threatened by the horrors of the war. These ruling elite know that no matter what happens, they will return to their warm and comfortable homes untouched by the miseries caused by the war. Moreover, when Balkan refugees displaced by the war arrive in the capital, these high-rank officers do not care about their misery. All they want is not to be disturbed by the scenery and not to see that wretchedness. In one scene, the protagonist is in the ferry crossing the European to the Asian side of Constantinople. She sees the reservist soldiers on their way to enlist themselves in the army. They are peasants from the provinces who bear the marks of heavy labor on their bodies. They are not trained as soldiers, nor are they aware of the fate that awaits them. The protagonist takes issue with the authority that separates these farmers, from their land and sends them to die on foreign borders. leaving their loved ones, especially mothers, in sorrow. She overhears an enthusiastic conversation about a prescription that cures rheumatism and utters in shock, quote, "Rheumatism? Don't they know that they are going to war? Don't they realize that they are going to warm up the cold Balkan soil with their own blood until, saturated and sated, it comes to life with the lives they lost and sighed to the whole world, enough, enough." Similarly, in another scene, a young man exclaims, "They intoxicate each other, they deceive the people and lead them to loss." And he adds, "All mouths on both sides, stifling the rumble of guns, should have been shouting, 'Enough, enough.'" Using class analysis as an analytical tool to critique militarism is not the only conceptual discussion introduced in Yesayan's Pavagan. In the scene I mentioned, where the protagonist is surrounded by a group of friends, bourgeois, urbanite, conversing about the war, Yesayan tackles the question of the right to fight. If the Balkan Wars is a fight for justice for Balkan people against their centuries-old oppressor, that is the Ottoman Empire, then the Turks have the right to defend themselves. Quote, "They finally start talking about the war with a heavy and serious tone. For some, the Balkan nations are within their fair and sacred right. Is it possible to imagine a holier war? They are fighting for the liberation of their persecuted brethren. What about the Turks?" someone objects. "Are they less rightful? They were attacked by the Balkan allies. Did they not have the right to defend themselves?" Naturally, yes. After all, right is on the side of the victor. Yesayan's intervention problematizes a discourse of rights that does not take power relations and the ideological manipulations into consideration. She asks, quote, "Right, a deceptive and treacherous word. It appears to me now as a contemptible jester who, beneath his colorful and bizarre clothing, wrinkling his face into flattering grimaces, bows and smiles now to this side, now to that side." Yesayan further tackles the concept of right by presenting through the characters the viewpoint that the said rights were acquired by the Ottoman state through centuries of violence, domination, and enslavement. Quote, "Only the weakness of the oppressed nations could have perpetuated that right acquired by violence," meaning the right of Ottoman Empire to dominate. "This war, then, is a fair punishment for the sufferings the Ottoman Empire caused. It is the curse of grieving mothers and orphans, and it was time for justice." The protagonist reflects on these ideas and poses the question of whether the time has indeed come. It is important to note that although the protagonist distances herself from this discourse of revenge, Yesayan herself in Pavagane's, this protagonist of Pavagane distances herself for a second from this discourse of revenge. But then if we read Yesayan's other texts from this period, we see that she herself, in her contemporaneous writings, refers to Armenians with similar wording as that used by her characters in Pavagane, the characters who are seeking revenge in Pavagane, when they refer to the people of the Balkans. For example, in Ameragneru Mech, Yesayan describes Armenians, quote, "as a race buckling under the burden of centuries of suffering and driven to distraction by the specters of persecution." And in Hokis Aksorial, My Soul in Exile in 1922, quote, "a people that has for centuries been groaning under a brushing burden of violence and servitude." So this is how in Pavagane the protagonist describes the Balkan people. In Pavagane, Yesayan's main criticism is addressed to the elite, who do not care about the masses, and the European imperial powers, who venture on the fate of subjugated peoples, like Armenians, who hope for political freedom in the form of socio-economic and administrative reforms granted and protected by the central state, self-governance and local autonomy, or national self-determination, everything that was promised by the European powers to Armenians. The protagonist condemns the conversations that revolve around European diplomacy, while, quote, thousands of peasants, thousands of unconscious and naive human beings are spilling their blood on both sides at this very instant, while European journalists and diplomats are discussing the fate of the Ottoman Empire. Yesayan's protagonist refuses to hear any explanation or excuse that presents the war as desirable or inevitable. During a visit to a friend's workplace, a French journalist, not affected by the war, according to Yesayan, teasingly talks about the situation while presenting a serious idea. "Where is their natural border?" shouts a French journalist. "If being short-sighted, we judge only by today's events, the Turks are rightfully defending themselves. But what if we look from history's perspective? Where is the natural borders?" In response, the protagonist brings back the loss of innocent human beings. Quote, "I heard today that there had been clashes at 4 major points, and while we talk and argue here, blood is surging like a flood at those points and clashes on 4 fronts. I keep thinking to myself, and they are allowing such a crime to take place." In the scene in which the character discusses rights, a young man, probably an Armenian, asks if the people who, quote, attacked, killed, and dishonored us didn't deserve this lesson. He is motivated by vengeance. The protagonist regards this young man as a soul sick because of witnessing the massacres and now in need of care. For the protagonist, that scale of violence that this young man is talking about and is full of revenge is an unimaginable nightmare that is impossible to grasp in its totality. When the young man talks about the horrors he witnessed, the protagonist says that she personally has not seen them because the protagonist in Yesayan's text is an urban bourgeois Armenian intellectual. It's also self-reflexive. Quote, "I personally have not seen such a diabolic reality. I have been unresponsive to the fate of my race. When they talk to me about massacres, it seems a centuries-old sigh erupts in my soul, and my thoughts, my imagination become confused. It is a nightmare which I cannot realize through reason, and which evaporates and disappears in the awfulness of the horror it has caused, like a delirious vision." Now, Yesayan presents 2 voices here. One, witnessed massacres, went through trauma, and is seeking justice in revenge, in vengeance, and talking about the rightful, also like pre-occupation, pre-imperialization borders, and the fight of the oppressed people. And the other voice that talks about no matter what, people should not die, and both sides, it's innocent people who are like disadvantaged classes are being killed for the interest of European diplomacy and the governance. So one reminds the reader that evil actions should not be forgotten, while the other strongly opposes the idea that only war can bring justice. The added layer to this text here opens a new thought path that introduces the colonial condition of being kept estranged from the reality of your people, talking about the class difference between Armenians, about this person who is full of ideas of peace and anti-militarism, being an upper class person and being in a colonial condition of being estranged from the reality of the people. Yesayan's first impressions when she landed in Cilicia in 1909 summarized this condition, because she was one of them before 1909. Summarizes this condition of this colonial condition of being kept estranged, forcefully, purposely kept estranged from the reality of the people in Armenia, in historic homeland, while in the Ottoman capital, she wrote to Dikran on June 18, 1909 from Mersin. These were her first impressions when she landed in Cilicia. Quote, however prepared I was for the terrible catastrophe, however much I may have thought there were exaggerations in the news that had already made the rounds, because they were receiving news in Istanbul, what I've seen is so appalling as to be past all imagining. I would never have been able to arrive at even an approximate idea of it before seeing it with my own eyes. Definitely the same intertextuality there that she's talking about, unimaginable, that she was not able to imagine until she actually saw it. She related later in Pavagan match, quote, what I saw was past all imagining. I find it hard to give an idea of the whole. With their ordinary, everyday meanings, words are incapable of expressing the terrible, indescribable scene that my eyes beheld. The paragraph that follows in Pavagan match presents an opposing stance to the one by the protagonist of Pavagan, who is distancing herself from, the idea of revenge as a response to the young man. So in Pavagan match, Yesayan's voice kind of aligns with that young man that she considers to be a sick soul in Pavagan. Quote, abandoning myself to the waves of pain, I felt my separate self gradually melting into the collective suffering. A new voice sounded in my soul, and painfully I awakened to a new kind of awareness. It was then that I communed with my race's veritable destiny. It was then that I relived all the hellish ordeals of which I had been told, but to which I had at the time remained a stranger. In her attempt to move away from hatred in response to injustice, Yesayan's anti-militarist thinking gives way to a critique of reconciliation that lacks justice. But if taking up arms may be the only path to justice, Pavagan intertwines scenes of observation and scenes of reflection. After leaving the scene with that young man in Pavagan, where the protagonist calls this man a sick soul, protagonist engaged in an inner dialogue while seated next to her baby's cradle at home. She repeats the words of the young man whom she considered a soul troubled by revenge. She reminds herself that, quote, the enemy violently attacked peaceful houses with babies in cradles. They committed crimes by murdering people and assaulting, quote, everything beautiful, powerful, and sacred. She reflects that it is true that the enemy is merciless. Her baby son's cries and uneasiness remind her of, quote, the inherited sufferings of her people and the uncertainty of the days ahead. Seated by the cradle, looking at his exhausted eyes, baby's exhausted eyes, she feels how she bends under the pressure of centuries-old slavery. As a mother, her wish would be to watch her baby live with pride and joy and to create a beautiful dream of the future. And yes, I am believing in motherhood and peace. But the mixed feelings of worry and dread disturb her motherly heart. She wants to sing and rock the cradle, but all the songs freeze on her lips. She would do everything to suspend all the storms and smooth all the roads for her child. She yearns to sow the seeds of love and peace in his heart, but instead, quote, forced to invite you into a struggle so that your head should never bow in slavery, and holding your hand lead to the path of ideals where so many mothers waited in vain for victorious returnees and which often became the path of no return for many martyrs. She knows that she cannot, singing songs of war as a mother means that sacrificing her son. The position of a mother that Yesayan introduces in this passage is in dialogic relation with her views on the role of mothers in educating children for peace, I discussed. Moreover, the imagery of not being able to sing a lullaby is also important when we consider that Ave Ragnarun match, in the other text, rocking and singing lullabies are mentioned in scenes where Yesayan rocks an 8-year-old girl who was raped and listens to the story of a mother who was singing lullabies to her dead child. So after this scene in Pavagan, by her child's cradle, the protagonist returns to the same discussion, now in another location, the French workplace, where she reacts to the hypocrisy of the French journalist. That scene ends with an exchange about the human need for forgiveness, which turns the focus of the text back to the issue of the dangers of reconciliation in the face of continuing injustice. What evil is he talking about? Talking about the French journalist again. Is he trying to say that we are going to forget the war soon? But no, he turns to me, smiles in a particular way, and wants to say something more. But here I remember my child's wet and sorrowful eyes, see the hereditary seal of suffering on his yet unformed face, and understand immediately what evil is being hinted to me. The next scene continues this line of thought. Turkish language newspapers keep their readers misinformed purposefully with false news of victory in order to support continuous recruitment for the Ottoman army. Quote, these officially deceived people, talking about Turkish people, that blood is demanded, a torrent of blood. She returns home and finds her Turkish neighbor waiting to ask her about the news covered in non-Turkish language press, because Yesayan can read non-Turkish language press. When she relates that news is bad, Ottoman army is being defeated, her friend, her neighbor, collapses in pain. Quote, she weeps loudly and mournfully. Surrendered to her sorrow, and before those heavy and warm tears, I feel the frost of inherited hatred subside, and my heart fills with kindness, and from the unfamiliar depths of my soul, fraternal or sisterly and consoling words rise to my lips. Unquote. Upon the defeat of the Ottoman army, the protagonist sees the first refugee women and children from Romania, the Muslims, deportees from Romania, arrive on the ferry. They are mistreated. She portrays the arrival day and night of endless caravans overflowing with Muslim refugees from the Balkans. They are mainly women, children, and elderly people with lost hope and a homeland left behind. Quote, the caravan of refugees continues to crawl forward into the melancholy autumn evening. Occasionally from beneath the straw mat covers, like a miracle shines the glance of a beautiful woman whose dream withers away in the shreds of the mist. What has she left in her abandoned homeland? And for what lost hopes or rights do her black eyes darken with sadness? Thicker than the autumn mist, personal sorrows are lost and disappear in the cloud of anonymous and universal misery. Dismal and ruthless, misfortune hovers in the air over their heads, and with spread wings leads, as it were, the caravan of refugees forward. The cattle following them, amid long and homesick bellows, imbuing the surroundings with their tragic mood, while the refugees communicate with each other in distressed, incomprehensible words and appeals. Soon a dull and woeful clamor will rise to the sky. A voice screams, and many voices respond with sighs. It seems the whole world is weeping. Watching them, the protagonist, or Yesayan, reflects on the commonalities between herself and these displaced Muslim people. She comes to strongly identify with them. The fear on their faces stirs her barely suited deep pain and reminds her the horrors she witnessed in another land. She doesn't mention, but I read it as Libya, where Yesayan landed in 1909 to help the survivors, similarly mostly women and children. And she writes, in Pavagan. Persecuted and fugitive. What is it that now becomes one and the same, harmonious between myself and them? The horrors of their expressions awakens in me familiar and deep wounds, unforgettable sorrows that have barely healed. I see clearly in my painful memory the evenings of a different country, when we would see in front of us a turbulent sea of victims of catastrophe. Clearly talking about Cilicia. This is the part of Pavagan in which Yesayan comes closest to speaking in the voice of an Armenian woman who witnessed the agony caused by mass violence against her people. In this passage, she seeks recognition and accountability, but she is realistic about her call for peace. Pavagan, watching these refugees coming from the Balkans and remembering Cilicia, manifests an ideal. Quote, if enemy nations knew that in times of misfortune they have the same appearance, the same soul, the same sighs they utter, the same woeful curses and supplications with similar emphatic forms and syllables, perhaps the impossible harmony and fraternity would be possible in the supremacy of misery. I feel how my soul thrashes its wings and tries to escape from its prison. My human compassion mercifully extends over the persecuted of another race. But as if avoiding the excruciating burden of hesitation, I swerve from my path and enter the fields. My soul is constrained with the chains of spite and resentment, and wingless it falls once again into the accepted ideas of justice and rights. It ends there. And I read it as a wish. Pavagan ends there with this accepted ideas of justice and right that she forgives. So this is a wish that expresses the potentiality of peace and reconciliation, perhaps, with an awareness of the condition of impossibility. She is aware of the impossibility of this wish. It is reminiscent of Yesayan's words while in Cilicia in 1909, expressed in the same letter to Dikran. Quote, it would be impossible to tell the Armenians apart from the Turks if the inconsolable grief that hopeless suffering inspires weren't stamped on Armenians' faces. The assumption has always been that speaking the same language and observing the same customs can foster solidarity among different races. Here, there is no distinguishing Armenians from Turks. They have the same physiognomy, the same accent, and essentially the same customs. The overriding influence of the climate has unified them as far as their physical appearance and mode of life go. And yet, massacres, pillage, and all the rest of it. So Pavagan ends with an inner conversation that resolves the oscillating thoughts that appear throughout the text that I presented, back and forth. The dialogue with the ancestors, Armenian ancestors whose voices are peaceful, bright, and forgiving, versus remembering and fighting for justice. And the protagonist of Pavagan unleashes herself from her chains into a feeling of compassion toward human misery, while holding onto an important truth, the truth of past and present injustices that remains unresolved in the text. So, to conclude, Zabel, Yesayan's Pavagan, and thank you very much for following it. It's a complex text. I think it's a fundamental text in the history of Ottoman political thought. It was composed by an Ottoman Armenian public intellectual at the very end of the imperial rule, almost the end of the imperial rule, and reclaiming this piece's place in the historiography requires addressing the silences imposed in Turkey on the Ottoman Armenian intellectual legacy that this piece documents, along with the lived experiences of Armenians. And I think it also opens up the possibility for a critical reflection on its relevance for today. Thank you.
Wonderful.
thank you so much. And now we'll invite Anna to go and join you at the table.
Hi everyone. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Karagözyan, Hasmik, Mehdi for organizing this, and Professor Bilal for making me a part of this very important event and giving me this opportunity to discuss your text. Actually, the article that coming soon
Came out actually.
came out.
Yeah.
Congratulations. And I want to congratulate all of us with this article because this is a very important contribution, not only for us, for Armenians, but universally speaking, because she was a person who went through many atrocities, witnessed it, and then came to write about it, write about peace, reconciliation. What I want to do now and today, I wanted to share with you my own experience with Zabel Yesayan, which started when I was 13 years old, when by chance I found Zabel Yesayan's Silihtari Bardesnere, the Gardens of Silihtar, in my grandfather's library. A Soviet Armenian who lived in a village belonging to Vaneti Armenians who came to Soviet Armenia, immigrated to Soviet Armenia even before the genocide. So it was there, and I didn't understand Zabel Yesayan well back then, but after coming to the Armenian Genocide Museum to work since 2006, I started reading the works of Zabel Yesayan again and again and again. And for those who are familiar with Yesayan, and those of you who read Yesayan, and those of you who can read Yesayan, especially in Armenian, I would suggest to go back and read it and reread it, because you will find different Yesayan's in her text. What is significant about Zabel Yesayan's writing is that she was very absorbing, and she wrote and described people's faces, their feelings, and their experiences in a way that she made you become a witness. So this is very important. When you read Yesayan, you feel that you are with her in the same room. And as a specialist on the Armenian history and the Armenian genocide history, I read Yesayan from that perspective, and I want to kind of reflect on that. So Zabel Yesayan, as Dr. Bilal mentioned, she came from upper class from Istanbul, and it was the first time that she went to Cilicia in 1909, right after the massacres, when she witnessed what happened with Armenian people. But it was also the first time kind of to be able to meet Gavarati Armenians, provincial Armenians. And we have the voices from Gavar coming, criticizing Istanbul Armenians, saying, you do not know us, you do not know our pain, and yet you are the ones who are making decisions on behalf of us. You are the ones who are criticizing us, or vice versa. So it was her first experience to go there and to meet these people, but of course to meet them in their misery aftermath of the Cilician Armenian massacres, which was in the literature back then was referenced as the Holocaust of Armenians, because many Armenians were burned alive. And for foreign representatives of the city, it was the Holocaust. This is what came into their minds. Very important thing, why Zabel Yesayan and other Armenian women were chosen to go to Cilicia. Because before Cilicia, 1819 Hamidian massacres took place. And Armenians couldn't go to Gavar, couldn't go to provinces to save their orphans. And they were all lost. According to also Yesayan's writings, she would say they were lost because they were taken care by others, foreigners, by Turks or foreign missionaries who were in the region, and it was losing their own orphans. And if you follow post-Hamidian period, you would not see Armenian orphans. So this was very important when it was possible after 1908 for Yesayan, for Sateni Gohanjanian, for other women, Theodik also, to go there and to be part of that rescue and organize these orphanages in Cilicia. Very interesting, and Melissa mentioned about her letters back to her husband, Tigran, and what we read after in Avirak Nerumej, in the ruins. She became the witness and the voice of Armenian women and children mostly, but also those who were victims of unjust, who were put into the prison for the crimes that they were not committed, because the Turkish state back then, the authorities, yes, CUP, they wanted to show that they want to rebuild Cilicia, they want justice, and this is the way of justice for them. Interestingly enough, she could visit prisoners, as Melissa mentioned. Why? And she writes back to Tigran why she could visit prisoners, because no one saw a danger on her. She herself was a woman in a very patriarchal society, and she had this very important power given by patriarch, by the Armenian community, to go to visit and to make changes when it was possible. And we should remember that when it comes to perpetrators, instigators, and face-to-face perpetrators are in different places, and of course she could go and negotiate with the authorities. And of course, in the personal level, she got some results. She could do her best, and she could never forget what happened in Cilicia and what she witnessed, because she would stay in the houses of survivors, and women and children, especially very young women who were all the victims of sexual violence, they would come, share their stories, they would cry, and they would seek her help in that situation. So this was something that deeply impacted her. So after 1909, she continues writing about this. She continues writing because perpetrators and victims were forced to live together without justice. And you speak about justice. It is very important because she sees unjust, that Armenian property was taken and was never returned. She sees unjust that Armenian orphans, she should fight for Armenian orphans to study Armenian language. They were taken from their families, and she sees this unjust, and she tries to find an intervoice, kind of, it was also her reflection, intervoice speaking to perpetrators in different levels. Perpetrators who came from her own class, who would speak about what happened in Adana, who would not show the ways to solve this, but who would bring the silence. Why? Because silence was important, according to them, to forget and to start again without justice. And I think this is very important when you connect her text that she wrote in 1912 and Pavagan, this text, and what she experienced with Cilicia. to make people to forget without justice and to suppress victims in the without transitional justice in the environment of violence. So, as you may know, Zabel Yesayan was in a list of Armenian intellectuals. She's supposed to be arrested on April 24th because already in 1915, the Turkish instigators understood her power and how powerful she was. So she was in that list, and so by luck she was not arrested and she escaped to Bulgaria. And first thing she did, she published her escape and how actually her friends were arrested, and she was very worried about their destiny. And it is such an important account of a person who could escape that violence, who is very much worried about what's happening with her friends, and she knew very well what's going to happen. So this is very important. Then she goes to so-called Russian Empire, not so-called, but Russian Empire, Tbilisi, Tiflis, which was a center of Eastern Russian Armenian intellectuals. It's not that she didn't knew Armenian intellectual thoughts and political thoughts back in Eastern Armenia or in Russian Armenia. But this was a new environment for her to know Eastern Armenians, Russian Armenians, and to share also Western Armenian, Ottoman Armenian experience of violence, what's going on, and to try to give lectures, to try to know activists also. She gave a lecture with Hovannes Tumanyan. But then she moved to Baku. And Baku was a center of very important center, industrial center for working class Armenians. And this is where she meets working class Armenians who have different kind of suffering. They suffer from the hands of their own kind, like they are Armenians, bourgeois Armenians, who would use them. The inequality, unjust, that we read in Shirvanzade's, Chaos and other works. And this is where her also kind of political change, in my understanding, takes place, because she also meets these communist activists, very important communist activists, Armenian communist activists in Baku. But from the Caucasian front, Armenian refugees come to both to Tiflis and Baku to find a refuge. And first time she also sees these Gavaratsi provincial Armenians escaping genocide. Again, they go to Zabel Yesayan to share their stories. What is important that their experience was different than of those who went through these deportations and ended up in concentration camps. This is the reason that she published in Gortz Ժողովրդի հոգեվարքը, The Agony of People, this very important genocide account by Hectorian, who was in concentration camps, who saw what happened with Armenians in concentration camps, and this is happening in Baku in 1917. She published in the newspaper Gortz. And others, Armenian activists would go and interview survivors. It became kind of a, she established this environment that people will be inspired by her. And not only that, those who went to those concentration camps and were able to survive would write their accounts and send it to Zabel Yesayan saying that this is what I witnessed, this is what I witnessed. And you will find this, unfortunately, unpublished eyewitness or survivors' accounts in Post Nouvelle Library or back in Charent's Museum Library in Yerevan. after the war, having witnessing both those Armenians in the Russian Empire, she travels to Tehran, she travels to Egypt, and she travels to Middle East to see what's going on, to witness and to gather the information about the Armenian survivors. And this is a very important journey because she not only records women's experiences, not only becomes their voice, but also meets very important Armenian activists in the region. And for example, Musher Seropian, who went there to rescue Armenian women and orphans from Muslim households. And the importance of rescue, the very urgence of rescuing Armenian women and children was essential because she understood going there and seeing the situation of Armenians that if we do not do that now, we will be lost as a nation. So this was very important, and we have the report that she prepared for Paris Peace Conference, and it was presented in League of Nations, and it was a very important piece still for Armenian genocide scholars who study, because she was the one who could bring two experiences together and to publish it. Then again, she comes back to the region, this time appointed by Boğaz Nubar Pasha, very important Armenian political, activist, and she came to Cilicia. She's supposed to go to Cilicia now in 1920 as an inspector of orphanages. This is also very important. She did it in 1909, and then now again she has to do the work, but she has a very important task given by Boğaz Nubar Pasha as a head of the Armenian delegation. So it was very important to see, to know what is happening on the ground, what is happening with Armenians. She arrives through Marseille to Egypt. And by the way, it is very important, when she arrived, I forgot to mention, in 1919, it was a huge event for Armenians. The Armenian newspapers in Cairo, for example, they published, Zabel Yesayan came to the city. You know, it also gave Armenians the sense that some Armenian intellectuals survive. The idea collectively Armenians felt orphaned after being, almost all Armenian intellectuals were killed. And this was a very important moment when some survived Armenian intellectuals will come to the city. So, and some Armenian women survivors went to meet her to share their stories, but also those who were in Egypt, they didn't go through genocide, but they knew her from her works and knew how important she is and her arrival to the city. So they would go and publish also about their meeting, about how she gave them dream, like to dream. As an Armenian girls, they read her work. This is also very important to mention. So the second arrival, she comes to Egypt and then travels to Beirut. And from there, she goes to Cilicia. What she sees, she meets with Armenian national unions, which were everywhere, organized by different Armenian communities, survived Armenian communities. And she sees that if in, for example, Beirut or Syria or Egypt, it was more organized, in Cilicia, it was chaotic. And why it was chaotic? Because it was already 1920, and Marash massacres took place. This is very important. We find her between, she comes to witness another violence. Survivors of Armenian genocide took a refuge in Cilicia, including Marash, and they were massacred. 16,000 Armenian survivors of genocide were massacred in Cilicia, and the French troops couldn't do anything to prevent it. So this is very crucial moment for her to understand why it's happening. Again, coming to just, when perpetrator and victim have to live together without justice, this is what is going to happen. And she writes about her impressions to Nubar Pasha, which is a very long, about 40 pages report, what she witnesses. It is, unfortunately, it is unpublished. Only half of this report is published in Armenian. And what she witnesses is Armenians being quiet, those who survived genocide and came back home, and Turks being terrified because Armenians came back, and because being afraid what's going to happen with them. So we see these two communities where once shared life, and after this enormous violence were forced to come together and to pretend that nothing happened. And you know what is important? That she mentions to Nubar Pasha, she says, I know and you know why we cannot live together, avoid violence between these two people. You know the reasons very well. The Turks are terrified that they have to give back the property, the Armenian property that they took. They are terrified they have to give up their slaves, their women or children that they adopted, and they are afraid that Armenians will instrumentalize by foreign powers to colonize them. So the terror coming from the Turkish side, and also Armenians being even quiet, not showing anything. She says that they are quiet and peaceful, trying to rebuild their lives. Even in that situation, they knew perfectly what happened in Marash is going to happen also here in Cilicia. And this is, in this context, self-defense was important. And this is how she could save 700 Armenian orphans, because she started negotiating with French authorities. She took them to Mersin, sent them, half of them to Cyprus, and in 1921, the half of the orphans were transferred to Beirut and Syria. This is how she could save Armenian orphans. But again, in that report, she writes about the possibilities. It was written in 1920. She says, what options we have? She writes to both Nubar. Can we live together? Not under the Turkish rule, because what we will do, we will disappear. We can somehow physically exist, but not Armenians. We will be someone else, if they will allow. But even in that regard, we don't have any guarantee of survival. And again, coming to justice, saying, without a just, we cannot recreate life. And we have to think about the possibilities, what we are going to do in order to save those who survived. And again, self-defense was crucial. I think I will stop here, and thank you so much, and we can start opening for Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you so much. What a wonderful pair of talks.
This
and
was like a
discussions.
good dialogue. dialogue. We started in my office and then.
And this was the
Two things
continuation.
yeah, I actually want to, can I like 2 minutes respond? On, one thing I thought of is, we kept saying, Yesayan is upper class, but she's like technically upper class, but she has some privileges, but her family is, has lost wealth, and they're actually working class family. Like she grew up in a family of artisans who were like doing, yazma. So from the very beginning, actually, like all of her writings, she's like, her first 1903 first novel is about Algerian Jewish immigrant woman in a like waiting for milk in a like a maternity hospital. So like from the very beginning, she was very attuned to class relations, and even like until the Barpakhachik. She like what I wanted to say, that not to I mean, we both said that she belonged to the bourgeois, and she did. But she was also always had this like sensitivity and tried to bring the experiences of the laboring classes and the revolutionary people, even before she met communists, and even before like, because there are some scholars who say that like, yes, became a communist after. For me, she was from the beginning very sensitive, very aware of class dynamics, and she writes in like culinary and in Postner, she writes about laboring classes, Armenian laboring classes, who are both like exploited by Armenian capitalists, who are also politically exploited, because they are criminalizing these laboring classes in Kavaratzis, mainly in Constantinople, who became revolutionaries. So how Armenian capitalist class in Istanbul are criminalizing these revolutionary workers because they think that they're gonna disturb the peace between the Armenian capitalists and the Ottoman elite. So yeah, like she has this like double consciousness of being from this bourgeois, Paris educated, like all these ideas that she brought from France about feminism and peace activism, and then she comes and she says, okay, like I'm an anti-militarist feminist, but also I belong to a subjugated people in an imperial context, and now and as you said, like I go to for the first time she sees, and it's a big shock that she's in Adana. She's like, we've been reading, but we never imagined the enormity of loss and cruelty. And she saw that, she saw pure cruelty. And one thing I wanted to add, you said Holocaust. In Arşavi Teotik's Adana report, she uses the word Vohçagez, which is exact translation of Holocaust. In 1909, Armenians used the word Holocaust for Armenia.
And also those who witnessed it, like foreigners who were in the city who saw, including Jews, and it reminded them Holocaust. So this term was used in 1909, and also I agree, and I want to add that this is the reason that she sees how ordinary people become like machine for war to go, either with this nationalistic ideas that they would be fitted, and so on and so forth. The wars are like, who benefits from those wars? Of course, not the ordinary people who would come back from the front, and they would be neglected. And this is very clear in her writing. This is how, in the beginning, she tries to find among her Turkish friends also those who would agree with her, who would also go against what's happening with Armenians. But she was very disappointed. And she, of course, in Pavagan, she writes about it. And it is also applies nowadays that we are not under the bombs and we forget what's happening in different regions in the world. And we become accomplices. This is very clear in her writing. She mentions it, saying that you didn't raise your voices, this is why you become accomplices. As this big machine of war makes all of us accomplices, because we go out, and then we forget about what's happening, children were killed and so on and so forth. Or even those Armenians who were far from those scenes of concentration camps or the mass graves, they also, 1 minute they think about what happened, the other minute they forget. And we went through 2020 Artsakh war, and when I was rereading her piece, I was constantly thinking about what we went through as a nation. It is really very, very similar what we went through, and the silence of international community, what happened with us, the displacement of people, and peace talks that's now going on without just, and we all know that it's not going to end well. So yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I knew Anna and I will sit together to talk about Yesaya.
Yeah.
So thanks for giving us the opportunity.
Thank you. So let us open this now to questions from our audience. Are there any questions? Yes.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This was so stimulating and thought-provoking. My question is about Yesayan's use of home and what home means to her. Because you also mentioned that, she talks about home and how, for instance, ruling elite, doesn't have to lose their privileges or lose their properties, homes. Yeah. And people who are forcefully being mobile. So my question is, especially regarding her intersectional identity, being a feminist and being an Armenian, how do you think does that provide her an understanding of home? Do we have this sort of modern dichotomy between home as a domestic sort of patriarchal space from a feminist framework, and home as a sort of the space of impossibility, space of loss from exile point of view? Do we have this kind of dichotomy, or if we don't have this kind of dichotomy, I guess what can we learn from Yesayan's understanding of duality of home?
Thank you so much. Yes. So, sorry, I got souffle. So actually, I remember Anna last night. Anna was telling me, your reading of Pavagan is so I don't know. So you, because you're from Istanbul. So, and yes, the question that you asked about home is so central, because my reading of Yesayan is also coming from this pain about my home, right? I can tell you that when her escape story that she published under a pseudonym, when I was reading it, woman, so she's running away from her home. She knows that she won't be able to come back. It's end of it. A home that she struggled, because she was born in Istanbul and then raised in Paris, but she returned to Istanbul. She was very active. She wanted to build in 1908. She came to Istanbul to rebuild a home in Istanbul. Even in her letters, she writes to Dikran, now we are here in Istanbul. We are back home, renting a place, buying furniture, literally. Building home in Istanbul, and this peace activism with Ottoman women and everything. And then and back and forth, it's a home that is full of turmoils and politics. We all know, those of us who are from Turkey, that 1 year it's like this, the other year it's hope, the other year but then in 1915 she knows that it's the end of it. And she looks at, those of you who are from Istanbul will, like, it really gives me a goosebumps. She's running away from Üsküdar, like the Asian side. She's literally like hiding, running in the middle of the night. She's gonna hide in a hospital for a couple of weeks. In that night, like dark, kind of escape. For one last time, she looks at the historical peninsula, or like Sultanahmet, Ayasofya. He looks at her, and she's like, you know, like my home, like Istanbul, you know, the silhouette of Istanbul. And they're like, look, like what is going on there? Like in this beautiful kind of like silhouette of my hometown, what is going on there? How many lives are being butchered there? Like for her, home is like this. And until the very end, she wrote about Istanbul. She's in Yerevan. What she writes is all about her childhood and labor relations and interethnic relations in Istanbul. She constantly writes about Istanbul. It's about belonging to a home that you love and invest and you want to make better, but it is almost like Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism. Right, it's very cruel to you. Like she looks at, she's nostalgic, one last time to like Istanbul silhouette and says like, I wonder who is being butchered there, you know. So and then she flees and then she comes back. Aksoryal, 1922. It's a story of coming back. My soul in exile. Obviously, she always thought of herself as being in exile. She belongs to Istanbul, and although like her years in Istanbul probably, if you calculate, are less than maybe like, yeah, I don't know, I didn't make that calculation, but yeah, she thought of her soul as being in exile. And in terms of home, obviously, again, like as a note that when she talks about, as Anna said, that report that Anna found out as a genocide scholar of gender and Armenian genocide scholar, that important report that she wrote, and the reason why we wanted to bring this together. In my paper, I didn't talk about that report, but when we were talking, I said, Anna, like you found something very important, because that report was not written in 1920, and Pavagan came out in 1922, and in that report to Bogos Nubar Pasha, she talks about self-determination, home. How are we going to live together in this home when, you know, without justice? So again, like all through her life, she was thinking about home, how to make that home livable again, inhabitable again for those who have been persecuted and who have been unsafe in that home. Connecting it to the feminism, yes, like Yesayan comes from the legacy of, she grew up reading Surpi Disop. Surpi Disop is an earlier generation feminist novelist who, for the first time in Armenian history and literature, wrote on, you know, familial relations, domestic space, how family and slaves women use that analogy that is sometimes problematic, sometimes is not from the actual enslaved people's perspective. But like the early first wave feminism used it a lot: enslavement and marriage, and enslavement and domestic life. So she's basically coming from that lineage of having read that, having also read Zabel, who constantly wrote about, you know, idealizing an ideal intellectual family, two intellectual Armenians like marrying each other and forming this intellectual and activist Armenian family, but at the same time, Zabel Asadur's novels are always, or stores are always, it's an impossible place, that there is no family and domestic sphere where a woman can be free and equal. Like they romanticize about it, but at the same time, it's a dystopic idea that family can be a liberating place for women. So like, yeah, she, like in her, also her, if you look at her life, she has a very kind of bohemian kind of lifestyle. Like they're in love, but they don't live in the same city often with Tikran, but they are comrades. Like she's someone who constantly writes to Dikran. Dikran go to Sheliga, like Dikran believes in the importance of what she's doing, like very supportive comrade, partner, but at the same time not necessarily, they don't necessarily have a very like conventional like traditional Armenian family. She's a very also like a feminist mother, because she writes to Sophie about like being, how it is important to, as a woman, to realize your dreams. And we have a lot of like accounts by her both children about their mother. So we know what kind of a mother she was, and her aunt. And imagine this woman, as you said, like the relationship between like home. So as you said, like her idea of women educating masses for peace kind of like turned into, this is for all Armenian feminist activists at the time, turned into like feminist women mothering a whole nation and making sure that they survive. And then all of a sudden, all these men, maybe like who were not necessarily in support of women's education, this and that, they were like, I should admit that we read more and more like how progressive Armenian intellectual men were back in the day supporting women's education. And like in the 19th century, when Armenian women started getting organized for their education rights and started the schools everywhere in the Ottoman Empire and Russia and Iran, with Adana and with genocide, you see that all these networks, education networks throughout the empires become mobilized for orphan relief and relief for survivors. Like if these women hadn't trained themselves in like not only like reading, writing, but also like finances, how to like manage money, like big sums of money for the schools that they established for girls, one generation later they wouldn't be able to like manage these finances to run orphanages, or like, you know, even like have the training to go and talk to Jamal Pasha and say like, you know, I'm an intellectual woman, I'm a public figure, like, you know, take me seriously, and like give me. So your question, like, is so right on, like both like home in both like feminist reimagination of home and feminist reimagination of Armenian nation and people is very much like kind of mobilized in the post-genocide. And you know, Lernaik Mekçoğlu also wrote a book about feminists surviving the nation, and Anna's own work about gender and genocide and post-genocide reconstruction of Armenian community through women. And then these women, as Anna said, for example, one example, Sateri Kohanjanyan is a Red Cross worker in 1909, and they work on the ground, we saw the photograph, together with Zabel Yesayan, and in post-genocide era, they meet again on the other side of the border, and these women are trained already as relief workers to work on the ground, and they start working for orphans. And this is like enormous work, because she wrote letters to like French, British, Italian, like she's fluent in French. You know, the fact that she was educated, and the fact that Armenian women's education movement was so successful one generation ago with the feminist movement, like benefited the survival of the Armenian people. When you have so many, like male intellectuals are killed, and mostly, and women are there to mobilize these networks for the survivors. And yes, its implications to the understanding of a home is, it would be a great paper, actually. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there other questions from there? Okay, Anush?
Yes. Thank you, both of you. This was such an incredible journey. I learned so much from the talk and the discussion, and I want to ask about, I was really interested in the idea of the colonial condition of the people and how the Istanbul Armenians were kept estranged from the condition of the Kavarati Armenians and remained strangers. And you mentioned that a little bit Melissa when Zabel Yesayan went to Adana in 1909. But then I'm wondering, from Anna's explanation of the incredible travels that she took throughout this lifetime, how did that relationship play out in these other spaces and her encounters with Armenians in Tbilisi and, in the Middle East, in Cairo, etc.?
I mean, this is almost a kind of overemphasized trope in Armenian history that both Sahais and Armenians in Izmir are kind of ignorant of Kavarati's armies. Of course, like, it's more complicated than that. Like, we know that there were a lot of migrant workers, Kavarati workers in Istanbul, in big cities. But, I mean, from Yesayan's perspective, I can say that she, not only Yesayan, many Armenian women intellectuals, they follow the trends among urban bourgeoisie in the 18th century of awareness toward the homeland. It doesn't start with Yesayan, it starts with Mkhitaryan's, rediscovery of Armenia. And then it becomes more like a political project, obviously in mid-19th century, like the first Armenian women's journal, feminist journal, Guitar, 1862, already situates Armenian feminist movement within the reconstruction of the Armenian homeland and the nation. So this idea of we have been estranged from our people in the Kavars has been central. There was a movement towards the homeland, reconstructing the homeland, Karakin Sirvansian's writings, of course, the ethnographic movement, Kavara in Karagan, there's a movement already. Ideologically, they're all kind of within this project of serving the serving Hayastan, serving the Kavars. That's actually why in 1879, Askanover and Protaser, two Armenian women's education organizations are founded. Askanover is founded to establish schools in the provinces, and until 1915 they established 50 schools, almost, maybe 45. But Protaser is to train teachers, train young women as teachers in Istanbul to be sent to these Kavar schools for girls' education. So there was this whole-scale movement of educating Armenian girls as a part of Armenian political awakening, intellectual awakening, and modernization, if you like. And it's the most important part of it that was the homeland. But many of these people had not been to homeland. Like Sibyl, who started Askanover at the age of 16, she went to Ankara and the surrounding regions, but she was never in what is historic Armenia and where Armenians were persecuted during the Hamidian. I think that also with 1862 Zeytun resistance, and then the following resistances really brought some level of awareness. Sırpıydısap actually wrote, because she was Mugariç Beşiktaşlıyan student, she wrote, she read Zeytun poems by Mugariç Beşiktaşlıyan. So Istanbul Armenians, upper class, upper middle class, they were very much kind of influenced by these peasant resistances starting in mid-19th century in places in the East, let's say, the Ottoman East. But yeah, as I said, if you look at all these feminist women, Adana was a turning point because, as Anna said, during the Hamidian massacres, they knew about the Hamidian massacres. They were censored. I mean, Askanover and Protaser was shut down. They were affected by, and they were reading letters and news in the newspapers. But in Adana's case, like Arshagui and Yesayan and other women, they actually went there for the first time to see what we are talking about when we talk about massacres, whole-scale atrocities. So, and all the other places, what she did, she went to Bulgaria, Philippe, and then to Romania, and by way of like Odessa, Black Sea, she came to Tbilisi, and then went down like Baku, and then went down to Iran, Iraq. He was in Baghdad, and then went to Cairo, and then Marseille, and then came back. No, from Marseille with that passport, from the stamps, you can see that from Marseille when she went back to Cairo, met the Armenian Orphan Society and Boğaz-Nubar, and then went back to Beirut and then back to Cilicia. That was actually like because they were traveling by way of sea. That's why that's the trajectory that they took. Yes, all these places, and it is not the first time that she went to Egypt. She was in Egypt in 1906. So it is actually not the first time that she communicated with Armenians in Russia and Iran. So if you read the letters and even like the local press, even like you look at the books sold in the local bookstores, these like imperial borders were so porous. Like Armenian intellectuals in Istanbul, in Constantinople, Bolis, in Tbilisi, in Tehran, they actually read each other's works, and in a way, they knew about each other. Like they got reunited there. They started like work for, but in another, and you're right that she also made sure that they know about Ottoman Armenians, Western Armenian writers, because in Baku and Tiflis, she gave these lectures about her friends, her pen brothers and sisters, published a book about the Ottoman Armenian literary figures, made sure that their legacy is not forgotten, and also to like help them raise awareness among Russian Armenians about Ottoman Armenian intellectuals and writers. So like became this figure. You were saying that like she's almost like both Eastern and Western, if these divisions are meaningful. And then she obviously ends up in Soviet Armenia, and then unfortunately she falls victim to Stalinian purges, and she was tortured and disappeared in 1943 by Stalin.
I have a quick question that actually pertains to one that we have online as well. The connection that Zabel Yesayan had with the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that she was sent to observe and document what had happened in Adana. It strikes me, what is that connection? And one of our viewers asks, based on her her attitudes about peace and justice, so powerful, her powerful writing, was she a woman of faith that she had this kind of connection? Or how did the connection with the Patriarch come about? Or is it known?
Patriarch, in that sense, it's I know about Dusab's fate, I know about Mari Beylerian's fate, who were both like very faithful but also very critical of the church and the patriarchal kind of worldviews of the church. But Yesayan, I wouldn't say she was, she was probably more, I don't know, atheist than socialist, yes. So you didn't need to be faithful to have a connection with the patriarch. Like patriarch is the head of the community and also the main mediator between the people and the state then. So patriarchate, the reason why patriarchate commissioned Armenians to go to Cilicia is because what happened is right after the massacres, there are 2 rounds of massacres, right? So what happens is CUP, the like newly kind of established like Committee for Union and Progress, they hide that they are complicit in this crime. They kind of like pretend like this is the massacres are by Abdulhamid supporters. And because everybody, actually Armenians, because there are Armenians MPs in the parliament. They are also like allies of Young Turks, CUP, and everybody is asking like, what's going on? That like there was a revolution, there was some kind of like, so-called revolution of like reconstitution of the constitution, and now we are in the parliament. We were going to be free and equal, and we have MPs, representatives in the parliament. So how did this happen? Like, why did this happen? And then like there was, I mean, it's a very long story, and Bedros Dermatosyan actually wrote a book about it. The summary is that Patriarchate commissioned, so the Ottoman Parliament commissioned a group of MPs, Armenians and non-Armenians, to go to Cilicia to write a report, and the Patriarchate commissioned a group to write a report. So these reports were going to be presented to the parliament, so that somehow, like, because there were court-martials, Armenians were persecuted on like false accusations. Most of these persecuted were self-defense organizers. So there was some level of like trying to, like, CUP acted like they were trying to bring the perpetrators into justice, but it was actually not the case. So there was a dispute, and they wanted to like prepare these like objective reports by these committees, so that like in the parliament the court martials can decide like what to do, how to punish. But at the same time, the Patriarchate obviously also sent Yesayan among these others to see what's going on, to write a report and to help the orphans. After Yesayan, Narshagui went 3 months later. So there were a lot of like women's organizations also going to Cilicia to work with orphans, as Anna said, and they also brought, women's organizations also brought orphans from Cilicia in 1909 to Istanbul, and they actually brought took care of them. Like, women were already organized by that time to be able to mobilize their networks and forces to work with the orphans. Probably that's also why Yesayan was sent, right? I don't know what.
Yeah, I think, and also, as I've mentioned, there were women, they could go places that men couldn't.
Yeah.
We have Pavagan who went there, who was collecting, and he was actually poisoned.
Yeah, he was.
And he was killed. And the patriarch was not a naive man, and he understood what's going on. And that's why I think one of the reasons, and Yesayan writes about it. She writes that, I was able with other women to go to places that others couldn't. So I think it is also very important.
And also like Arshagui sent a note to the prisoners and gave some money, food. Like, women were, as you said, like, because they were not considered as dangerous by the Ottoman authorities, they were able to like do these things. And also Red Cross, because she was a like, I think because she was a woman, and although not very like active in women's organizations in Istanbul, she was in 1908 enlisted to Askanover. I don't know why they didn't send Zabel or somebody else but her, probably, I don't know. But when she went there, she actually assumed the role of the director of orphans in Cilicia. So she was sent there as as a almost like a domestic role, but there was nobody else who could take care of these children, like really young children and women who were like victims of sexual harassment. You really needed women to organize that relief.
Thank you. Well, I think this is all we have time for in terms of questions, but thank you again. Let's thank our wonderful speakers. You can actually actually stay where you are. I'll just close us. Thank you again to our audience in person, those online. Let me just mention, we have several other events that are upcoming in our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. On Friday, April 25 at 1 p.m. Pacific Time, Professor Vedros Dermatosian of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln will provide the annual Raymond Gevorkian Genocide Commemoration Lecture. This will be in person in Bunch Hall, and the subject is Sahag II Pavagan, Catholicos of Cilicia as witness to massacres and the Armenian Genocide. This is hosted by the Richard Hovhannissian Chair of Modern Armenian History and is co-sponsored by our Promise Armenian Institute. As a heads up, in May, we have a hybrid lecture scheduled by one of our current Promise Armenian Institute postdoctoral scholars, Dr. Anush Suni. This will take place on Monday, May 12th at 6 p.m. on her research pertaining to material afterlives of the genocide, violence, memory, and landscapes of ruin in Vaughan. And then finally, we have a Zoom-based lecture by the historian Dr. Linda Barris. This is scheduled for Tuesday, May 27 at noon. This will be Zoom only, on the subject of the connection among Armenian identity, religious beliefs, and mental health amongst the ethnic Armenians in Turkey. So before we close, let me once again thank our wonderful Deputy Director, Hasmi Bagdasarian, for running everything behind the scenes, as well as Mary Sakayan for coordinating this event. So thank you all for being here. I invite you to continue to have refreshments and to mingle with our distinguished speakers. Thanks again.